What can be verified from the historical record is that 15 Allied flying boats were destroyed at Roebuck Bay on March 3, 1942, with 6 drying or semi-drying wreck sites known and a smaller number of deep water sites relocated or interpreted through later survey work. They were destroyed during the same raid within minutes of one another. That shared event creates a rare common loss baseline in aviation archaeology. It does not make the wrecks a perfect control group, but it gives investigators an unusually tight starting window for comparing how different parts of the bay have shaped the surviving metal. Yet the exact identities of individual aircraft within this fleet remain difficult to confirm because every piece of wreckage is governed by a strict non-disturbance boundary. The objective for the investigation is to establish a comprehensive condition baseline for the site, but the primary constraint is absolute. Investigators cannot lift, move, or salvage a single airframe component to verify its origin. That shared starting point gives the Broome flying boat wreck site its unusual operational framework. In typical aviation investigations, single aircraft are found isolated, each subjected to its own mechanical failure, impact energy, and timeline of material degradation. The Roebuck Bay assemblage is different because that shared loss history compresses the usual starting variables before later site conditions begin to diverge. Decades later, the value of that shared starting point lies in the contrasts it exposes. Variations in metal condition, bulkhead collapse, wing separation, and engine exposure can reflect microenvironment, burial, tidal scour, aircraft type, fire damage, post-raid salvage, and later disturbance. For engineers and archaeologists, the raid window remains a chronological anchor against which those differences can be measured. Having a rare common loss baseline only matters if investigators can access the data. At Roebuck Bay, access is defined by heritage protection, community memory, and the probability that human remains may still be present among the wreckage. The site was protected under a conservation order and then entered on Western Australia's Register of Heritage Places. Today, the Older Heritage of Western Australia Act of 1990 has been replaced by the Heritage Act of 2018. The wrecks are widely respected as war graves, but the legal mechanism is heritage protection rather than a simple military war grave statute. That classification redirects the investigation away from conventional recovery, where heavy lift equipment might otherwise raise major sections for close inspection of hidden manufacturer plates. Authorized work has still occurred under controlled conditions, including limited surface recovery, test excavation, corrosion measurement, and sediment removal. But ordinary salvage is not the operating model. Investigators are not free to cut into cabins, remove engines, or dig through sediment simply to locate technical data plates. The legal boundary pushes the operation toward a survey-first track. The field team can measure geometry, record corrosion, inspect exposed features, and map debris fields. But any disturbance requires authority and a conservation purpose. This non-disturbance mandate creates an immediate procedural friction. The goal of identifying aircraft types and documenting current degradation has to be balanced against heritage protection and the dignity of a memorial site. The shared loss event provides a theoretical model for how the aircraft entered the archaeological record, but proving the current reality still requires field data. Some of that evidence has also been altered by wartime salvage, later clearance, and unauthorized removals. The site therefore serves not as a pure, untouched laboratory, but as a protected archaeological landscape with a rare common starting point. The remaining problem is evidentiary rather than theoretical. The question becomes how investigators extract forensic data from a submerged fleet when the most diagnostic evidence may be buried, fragile, protected, or already missing. 20mm cannon fire and incendiary ammunition fundamentally altered the aircraft geometry, but the collapse sequence remains a site formation model rather than a single mechanism proven across the fleet. Understanding the mechanical sequence of the loss remains critical because the fire damage and sinking processes from March 3, 1942 shaped the wreckage that maritime archaeologists survey today. As the fleet sat at its moorings, the aircraft were attacked by Japanese Mitsubishi Zero fighters. The defining variable was strafing against fueled, overcrowded flying boats in shallow and deep water positions. Incendiary fire was especially destructive against thin aircraft skin and fuel-bearing structures. Once fuel ignited, heat, blast, and burning fabric, metal, and fittings could destroy the upper works of a flying boat very quickly. Aviation aluminum loses strength under sustained high temperature, but the surviving wreckage does not prove one identical top-down collapse sequence across the whole fleet. The result is better described as severe fire damage, impact damage, and subsequent sinking rather than a uniform mechanical collapse. Wings, engines, tails, and hull fragments often remained close together on the seabed, but their exact relationships vary by aircraft type, position, fire intensity, water depth, and later disturbance. Some wrecks show strongly collapsed upper structures, others require more cautious interpretation. Surveyors have confirmed that intact flying boats should not be expected. The easy visual markers have often been burned away, broken, buried, salvaged, or corroded. What remains is a field of lower hull sections, engine masses, wing elements, floor structures, and scattered diagnostic fragments. The geometry is often flattened or fragmented, leaving external form as the main surviving clue. This destruction pattern directly affects the operating constraints placed on the surveying team. Many people died in or around the flying boats during the raid, including civilian evacuees, women, and children. The exact death toll is uncertain, and not every name was recorded. That human loss permanently changes how the site is discussed, visited, and managed. That loss helps explain why formal heritage protection and local memory frame the wreckage as more than technical debris. This classification creates a strong barrier to traditional forensic recovery. In standard aviation archaeology, if the upper half of an aircraft is destroyed, engineers may seek evidence in surviving lower sections, floor structures, cabin fittings, or manufacturer plates. At Roebuck Bay, that logic yields to controlled, conservation-led access. The legal and ethical boundary forces a hard operational trade-off. The mandate prioritizes preservation and memorial integrity over exhaustive forensic recovery. Investigators must accept that some definitive technical evidence may remain buried in sediment, hidden inside fragile structures, or unavailable without unacceptable disturbance. The physical destruction erased many easy visual markers, while heritage protection restricts the search for internal ones. For surveyors, that combination leaves one practical path forward. With the upper structures burned or broken and the lower hulls partly buried, investigators had to design a mapping strategy that relied primarily on external geometry. Relying on side-scan acoustic mapping to outline deeper wreckage became an operational necessity, because Roebuck Bay can turn visual data into a blank wall. Of the 15 flying boats, 6 were wrecked in drying or semi-drying positions, and 9 were reported in deeper water. Later surveys have relocated or interpreted only part of that deep water group. Some inspected targets sat in roughly 6 to 8 meters of water, while others lay at about 15 to 20 meters. Operating in these zones forces the survey team to navigate strong tidal range, shifting sediment, and poor underwater visibility. This suspended sediment can reduce visibility to less than 1 meter at some sites, making conventional visual survey difficult or impossible. To put human operators in the water safely, dive supervisors have to work around narrow slackwater or neap tide windows. A neap tide reduces the tidal exchange and can create a more manageable pause in the flow. Diving outside the workable window does not guarantee disaster in every case, but it can rapidly turn a controlled inspection into a drift, a blackout, or an aborted survey. Because suspended sediment defeats light-based inspection, the next layer of evidence came from side-scan sonar. Instead of relying on light, the side-scan sonar emits high-frequency acoustic pulses that cut directly through the turbid water and bounce off the hard structural edges of the aviation aluminum. As the sonar towfish is pulled through the channel, it paints a continuous digital picture of the seabed based entirely on the returning sound waves. This gave the team a way to work around poor visibility while still depending on later confirmation. The acoustic sweeps did not simply reveal all 9 deep water wrecks as finished, named targets. Early side-scan work produced possible targets, later surveys produced additional deep water anomalies, and some positions were then fixed with GPS for diver inspection. The sonar returns helped identify areas of wreckage more than 1 meter long or zones where many pieces of debris lay together. They gave the survey team a way to narrow the search without relying on visibility alone. Through these systematic acoustic passes, the survey team began to define the deep water debris fields and candidate wreck sites. The maps were essential, but they were not a complete answer. Sonar could guide divers, show broad structure, and mark possible wreckage. It could not by itself conclusively name every aircraft or establish the exact limits of every debris field. However, identifying the shape of an underwater anomaly is only the first step of the survey. Because the aircraft experienced severe fire damage, sinking damage, salvage, corrosion, and burial, the sonar returns do not look like intact flying boats. They appear as complex geometric puzzles of flattened and scattered metal. To translate those shapes into aircraft structure, archaeologists applied a specialized analytical workflow known as the defabrication method. The defabrication method operates as a reverse engineering process. Investigators start with original line drawings of the suspected aircraft types. They then work backwards from the surviving wreckage, asking what is missing, what is out of place, and which visible attributes are diagnostic of aircraft type and model. By comparing modified drawings with site plans, photographs, and sonar data, the team can interpret major structural elements such as hull axes, wing positions, engine locations, and tail elements. This analytical process is vital for the non-destructive survey track. It helps the team reconstruct the post-impact condition of aircraft from external data and limited inspection, without treating every interpretation as absolute proof. The combination of acoustic mapping and defabrication help define positions and flatten profiles while respecting the protected site. Accessing the shallow water wrecks demands precise timing against a hard environmental constraint. To visually inspect the coherent evidence resting on the seabed, investigators and visitors must wait for very low spring tides, with local guidance commonly pointing to tides below about 0.86 meters, depending on datum and conditions. When the water recedes far enough, the ocean temporarily exposes an immense expanse of coastal mud. Survey supervisors must then coordinate a rapid deployment. The field team may have to cross roughly a kilometer of dense, unstable sediment from town beach to reach the debris fields. They must execute visual inspections, record dimensional data, and return to solid ground before the tidal flow reverses. Working within this highly constrained window, archaeologists documented 6 drying or semi-drying wreck sites. The environment of this specific zone dictates the physical condition of the surviving wreckage. The thick coastal sediment can provide a preservation benefit. It can bury lower structures, reduce oxygen exposure, and slow some forms of corrosion that would otherwise attack exposed aviation aluminum and steel. But the mud is not a perfect seal, and it does not halt decay. Exposed metal still suffers from corrosion, biological growth, tidal abrasion, and periodic reburial or exposure. The intertidal mud has helped preserve parts of the lower structural geometry, but that preservation is uneven and conditional. The same preservation mechanism also imposes a forensic limit. Mud burial can conceal critical lower hull evidence and internal cabin structure, leaving the team to document only the elements that naturally protrude above the sediment line. Fortunately, some of the heaviest components resisted complete burial. Engine blocks, wing roots, and hull sections can protrude from the mud and serve as coherent evidence for the drying zone. To identify aircraft type at each location, archaeologists use visible configuration, structural layout, site position, historical records, and where available, recovered or previously documented artifacts. Engine configuration profiling can produce strong type-level evidence when exposed radial engines, cylinder arrangements, engine spacing, hull proportions, and wing geometry are compared against historical aircraft specifications without dismantling an airframe. At Roebuck Bay, the 6 drying and semi-drying sites include Dornier DO-24KX-23, Dornier DO-24KX-1, PBY-5, Catalina FV-N, PBY-5, Catalina Y-59, 1 unidentified PBY-5 Catalina, and 1 unidentified Catalina. This is a verified and useful classification layer, but not every identification rests on cylinder count alone. This procedural success showed that external observation could establish a useful type-level map for the drying zone. Yet a critical gap remains. Moving from type identification to specific individual airframes requires diagnostic proof that may be buried deep inside muddy hulls. The deeper channel presented the opposite problem. Acoustic mapping could outline structure, but suspended sediment could still block the close inspection needed to resolve identity. The remaining problem was structural interpretation. Knowing the spatial geometry of detached components relative to a main body is critical. In standard forensic operations, engineers map the distance and heading of a separated engine block to understand the localized debris field. In a clear environment, detached engines can act as diagnostic markers. In the deep water channel, however, those conditions can neutralize the detached engine technique. The visibility problem blocks many forms of direct inspection. Surveyors cannot always swim down and count cylinders on detached engines. Acoustic equipment can project the broad geometry of a collapsed fuselage or debris field, but it does not reliably deliver the micro-resolution needed to count individual engine cylinders or exhaust stacks in every case. Therefore, the spatial relationship between a flattened hull and a detached engine block may remain suggestive rather than conclusive. For some deep water targets, the evidence may identify a wreck field without separating a submerged Catalina from a submerged Dornier. The forensic problem compounds when attempting to isolate a single specific aircraft from the rest of the fleet. Beyond type, the harder objective is matching a mapped wreck to a specific historical airframe. The Dutch military Catalina Y-59 should not be used as an example of an aircraft whose identity is permanently locked away. A fork recovered during a test excavation carried the aircraft number and conclusively identified that drying wreck as PBY-5 Catalina Y-59. A safer example is an unidentified deep-water Catalina, or one of the unresolved debris fields where individual identity still requires diagnostic proof. At Roebuck Bay, many internal identification methods remain constrained because cabin evidence may be buried, unmapped, fragile, or protected from unnecessary disturbance. Even where inspection is possible, it must remain controlled, justified, and conservation-led. The site demands minimal intrusive confirmation. The survey team cannot simply dig for manufacturer data plates or extract internal serial numbers because doing so would disturb a protected heritage and memorial landscape. Consequently, the individual histories of some aircraft remain trapped inside inaccessible, buried, or poorly visible sections. The operation must therefore halt at a partial resolution. The fleet can be located, mapped, and partly identified, but detached evidence and internal technical signatures do not always yield individual airframe identities. The ongoing degradation of exposed structures above the mudline establishes a critical time window for monitoring. This deterioration is tracked primarily as a passive baseline. Every passing year may strip away a fraction of the remaining upper metal, expose new fragments, or rebury existing ones. Instead of attempting to halt natural decay through broad extraction, management favors controlled stewardship, protection, recording, non-destructive monitoring, and, where authorized, limited conservation-led intervention. Within this protected heritage and memorial landscape, salvage logic gives way to conservation, recording, interpretation, and carefully authorized fieldwork. This shifts the focus from recovery-driven forensics toward long-term stewardship. Because earlier surveys established a condition baseline across shallow and deep contexts, archaeologists now have a point of comparison for debris field geometry and structural alignment. Future operations will use that baseline for watchlist monitoring, with teams returning periodically to measure environmental wear on exposed aluminum and track major sediment shifts across the tidal flats. Monitoring the site requires disciplined data management rather than physical labor. After extreme weather or severe storm surge, surveyors will use external observation to update digital logs, recording exposure, reburial, and other dimensional changes against the established baseline. This methodology keeps the scientific focus on measuring change rather than reversing it. The baseline metrics established during the initial mapping sequence define exactly what future monitoring teams must look for. They will track the precise settlement of the heavy components into the mud layer. They will measure any new structural separation between the heavy engine blocks and the adjacent wing sections. They will also document the gradual biological colonization on the exposed metal surfaces. These passive data points allow the stewardship program to detect significant structural shifts over time and adjust preservation models without moving protected fabric. This management strategy requires accepting some unrecoverable data. Rather than extract diagnostic hardware into a controlled analytical environment, the survey-only objective prioritizes the protected site boundary over additional technical artifacts. Environmental difficulty reinforces legal protection, but it cannot replace it. Rapid tidal change, poor visibility, and deep mud make casual disturbance harder, especially in deeper water, while the drying sites remain accessible on very low tides. Because unauthorized salvage and removal have occurred, including engines, materials, and even deep water artifacts recovered without authority, site security remains uneven. Public education, legal protection, monitoring, and respect for the memorial remain essential. The knowledge gained from non-destructive mapping proves that large underwater and intertidal aircraft sites can be charted without dismantling the physical continuity of the environment. Investigators managed to define much of the field, classify visible evidence, identify several drying sites, and map the limits of what the environmental conditions allow them to prove. The stewardship model aims to keep the wreckage largely undisturbed, functioning as a protected archaeological and memorial landscape for future generations. The flying boats remain in the mud and the channel, yielding geometry to sensors and low-tide surveys, while leaving some individual identities unresolved.